How are you doing? I hope you're having a fantastic day. I want to talk to you about Jim Butcher, The Storm Front, first book in the Dresden Files book series, and why it has the single best opening I have read this entire year. I want to talk to you about this, and I will argue to you, why this opening, the opening of the Stormfront book is flawless. Flawless. One more time, flawless. Let's go. Oh my God. I hope you're not scared by that. Okay, so normal conversation, nothing weird, nothing strange, no shoes. Let me show you something, right? I think you would agree with me, and I hope that you will, that a good opening to a book contains three elements. The first element to a good opening of a book is to establish the conflict of the story. For instance, let's say you are telling a story where you have, let's say, your protagonist wants something. Let's say they want to maybe become a great warrior, right? And the beginning of the story, the first chapter, maybe you want to set them off on their story, right? And this is very crucial. Famous examples include like Harry Potter, where quickly in the beginning of the story, we establish that this is the chosen one. We establish that this, child is very special. And we establish a lot of things in just the first few chapters. In The Lord of the Rings, quickly, Frodo is off on his journey. The Fellowship just moves quickly. There are so many examples. These are famous examples. And literally, I can sit here all day telling you different examples. But the point is, when you have a beginning of a story, the beginning should establish the conflict of the story. So that's the first one. And I think you will agree with me for the second one is going to be establishing tone, right? So if you want to establish a tone to a story, you best do it in the beginning of the story. Hopefully, if it's a book, you best do it in the first chapter. If you don't successfully do it by the first chapter, and let's say you have a super serious prologue, like The Way of Kings, the first prologue talks about 4,500 years ago, something like that, and there's like some epic battles going on. The Wheel of Time, holy moly, like that establishes a tone of epic proportions, and it establishes a tone that is very serious, right? In the book of Malazan, which I've read first few chapters, and I plan to read this coming summer, the whole series. I hope I will get to it, and there's not going to be something fantastic that will come up and stop me from reading it. But you get the point. You have to establish the tone of the story in the first few chapters. Now, let's talk about the final thing that you have to do when it comes to beginnings of a story, right? That would be establishing the world and calling to adventure. Very few authors can successfully do all three. If you're a writer, you have heard this countless times where, the point of a beginning, or the first chapter is to establish the tone, establish the conflict, which we have discussed, but also establish the world. But you see, this is asking a lot from most people. Maybe you've done it yourself before. It is really, really difficult. I've tried doing it myself. Super, super difficult. But the point here is that if you have established the conflict, if you have established the tone, you have to establish the world, and it comes in conjunction with calling to an adventure, right? So, for example, the first book of the Mistborn series, The Final Empire, written by Brandon Sanderson, what you have is, there is this group of people that are really enslaved, and the whole story revolves around these people going free, right? Because there's this, corrupt regime that is really enslaving them. And you get a taste of that, and you are introduced to not the protagonist, but you're introduced to like a secondary protagonist, and he's really badass, and he establishes the world, and he calls to an adventure, right? So there is this world where there is this group of people that are enslaved, and now they have gone free. There is you are told about different people across the world who are saying there's like a resistance being mounted, right? And you hear hints of this, and this is a call to an adventure, right? But he also establishes the world in the sense that you get a good amount of world building. You get your first time you're introduced to the mist, right? And it is awesome. It is really amazing, and he does a great job. The Stormfront, I would say, is better than most books out there, even The Final Empire I just talked about. And I would argue to you that it is better primarily because of its call to adventure, number one, and number two, its establishing of tone, and number three, its establishment of conflict, right? Now let's talk about the first one, which is establishing the conflict, okay? And if you're enjoying the discussion I'm having with you, please, just consider subscribing and like this video. There are three sides to this conflict, right? Where we have Dresden, this wizard, and he lives in Chicago, right? And what ends up happening is that, first of all, he's struggling financially. This guy is really broke. And before Dresden leaves his office, in the beginning, he establishes that Dresden is financially struggling. But number two, there is a homicide that happened recently, and it is so brutal and it is so weird and alien that Murphy, this lieutenant who will, you will see more of them in the story, this lieutenant sort of, he gets basically summoned and he is going to help with this case because he's a wizard and he's going to help with the case. Why? Because it's a very bizarre, weird looking case. This probably has to do something with magic, right? And that conflict is very well established to a point where Butcher goes, he stops doing some work and, his office work, and he goes to meet the lieutenant, and we see the scene of the homicide. And in that setting, when we go there, when we see the homicide, what Butcher does, he establishes the, two things, right? Which is the conflict, first of all, of the homicide. But number two, he establishes the conflict between, Butcher as well as the Never. I believe that's how you say the name. I've always said it that way. I've never said it out loud. This is the first time I'm saying it out loud. He establishes the conflict between, Butcher and the wizarding world. That's a Harry Potter terminology, but you get the point. There's this wizard and he's in Chicago, right? And there are rules to use in magic. There's like 7 of them. And if you break any of the rules to use in magic, the tiniest literal infraction of magic rules will have you freaking killed. And there are people who are waiting for the protagonist to mess up so they can just, come and scoop him up and really just kill him. So he establishes that conflict, which is a conflict between a conflict between, Dresden and the world of wizards and witches, which is Never, right? But number two, he establishes the homicide. And number three, he establishes the outer world. In this particular case, we start the story in the office, crammed in the office. It's like a small place. It's a cozy, homey place. But then he goes outside and there's like all of this that you're introduced to. And all of a sudden, Dresden is having conversation with like mobsters and all of these different people. And that is really awesome. That is great. That is fantastic. And what it does is it establishes the outer world. So those are the three conflicts in the story. And it is between Dresden as well as the White Council of wizards who keep the rules. They set the rules. You don't break the rules. And number two, between Dresden as well as the homicide, which is like investigating the mystery. Who did it? Is this magic? Is it not? And number three, it is between Dresden and finance, money, right? He basically is struggling. And there is that awesome thing, right? He establishes the conflict very, very quickly in the first 1 to 3 chapters of the story. Number two, let us establish the tone. No. Just listen to this, okay? And tell me if it does not establish a very strong tone.
The mailman walked toward my office door, half an hour earlier than usual. He didn't sound right. His footsteps fell more heavily, jauntily, and he whistled. A new guy. He whistled his way to my office door and then fell silent for a moment. Then he laughed. Then he knocked. I winced. My mail comes through the mail slot unless it's registered. I get a really limited selection of registered mail, and it's never good news.
Everything in that opening line literally speaks awesomeness. Why? Because the rest of the story has the same exact tone. The rest of this, Butcher is such a master because he Literally, most authors will have a first sentence, and then 20,000 words down the line, they have a completely different tone. Whether maybe they start comedic, but then they end up, going complete Warhammer, or they start complete Warhammer and they go more comedic. And that is really not with Dresden. With the Dresden Files, what you end up having is a consistent tone that is established. And oftentimes it is like, it feels like film noir. When basically Dresden Files is film noir, but for wizards. That is awesome. He knows his stuff so well. Whatever he does in the first sentence never, ever, ever stops being consistent. How can you be so consistent for an entire book? Ask yourself this question. It's really tough to answer because most of the times it's difficult to stay consistently with a tone that you have established. And then there is the final one, which is building the world. There are so many examples where Butcher spends, brief, masterful paragraphs building the world. In what way? Oftentimes, what I hate about books, fantasy books especially, is that you will end up reading the first few chapters, and then by the second chapter, you are basically reading a Wikipedia, where you have very little going on and a ton of stuff, basically building countless different, conflicts that have happened in history and summarizing them. And by the fifth chapter, you have forgotten most of those if you are one of the few people who has actually managed to read through them. Basically what I do is I skim them, and I purposefully skim them. But what Butcher does is whenever Dresden is basically doing anything that is remotely connected to the world of wizards, never, what ends up happening is that he basically makes sure that he establishes that. He makes sure that he gives you snippets. He never gives you a dump. He doesn't give you 2-page, basically encyclopedia where he's reading you the gospel. What he does is he just kind of does Butcher things where he's enticing you. And I think heavy, deep exposition does happen in the story. It's not much, don't worry about it, but it only starts after the first quarter of the story, into the 25% mark, after which you will start having like maybe a whole page of info dumps, but it's really not a problem. Why? Because you have been hooked already. You have been properly introduced. Butcher basically respects you, and he expects you to read the story not necessarily for the info dumps and for the history it has, but precisely for what is happening now. So what he does is he spends a lot of time establishing the conflict, the tone, the setting, and finally he gives you snippets of the world. This is something I have loved in Mistborn, but I've also hated in The Way of Kings, because what Brandon Sanderson does with The Way of Kings is that he switches. He literally gives you 3 prologues. I love 2 of those prologues, but the first one is pure garbage and it should be literally dumped. He's literally always world building. It's just that it doesn't feel world building. It's almost always like super masterful, and he knows what he's doing. And then there's the final thing, which is a call to adventure. So this, and basically it is, let's say, the boy leaves the farm. What is that? That is a call to adventure. It's so generic in fantasy, where you have this boy who is basically special and he's going to be running around as the chosen one. But basically he starts out normal, boring, doing nothing. Why? Because it's a call to adventure. It's like, oh, this dude has a comfortable life. Soon we're going to throw him into haywire, and we're going to be literally just, having fire-breathing dragons, chase him around. So that is a call to adventure. Butcher does this exceptionally well, and he does it better than anyone I have ever seen, because I just want to live, like, if you live in a place, if it's a city, you could literally be living next to Butcher. You just don't know it. And that is so awesome. I don't know why. I think that's really amazing. And he calls to an adventure. Why? Because Butcher is in his office. He's doing, like boring paperwork. And then he just goes out. He goes out. The act of going out of the office is literally a call to an adventure. It is so simple, it is so unnoticeable because it's literally so masterfully done. If you're a writer, I'm sure you will notice this when you read the story. And so, yes, basically, these are the 3 tenets to a good opening. And the 3 tenets to a good opening are not only adhered to in the Dresden Files, but they're exceeded far and far beyond anything I have seen in most fantasy books. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this particular video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining me. I honestly, I'm so appreciative of the fact that you've reached here. So God bless you and have a nice day, man.